A typical query we get is how should we be storing videos or images when working with MongoDB? So in this tutorial, I'm going to build the Java Spring Boot API that stores your images or videos in Azure Blob Storage and then stores the metadata in MongoDB. This way you can leverage the best of both technologies. For this tutorial, we're going to use Spring Initializer to create our Spring Boot app. So for project, I'm going with Maven and language is Java. After that, we're going to choose our Spring Boot version and then give our project a name. So I just called mine MongoDB-blob. After that, we're going to add our dependencies. So there's 3 dependencies we need for this. First one is MongoDB. So that's our Spring Data MongoDB. After that, we need to make it a web app. So we're going to use Spring Web. And lastly, we need the Azure dependency. So if we just go, and here we're going to go with Azure Storage. After that, everything looks correct. Just make sure for packaging you select jar, and for Java use the version of Java that you're running. So I'm running version 17. After that, we're just going to hit generate. It will create a zip file that we can open up in our IDE. I'll join back once I have that opened up. Once you have that opened up in your IDE, there's a couple of resources we need to add. So if you go over and open application properties, first thing we're going to do is we're going to tell it what port to run on. So just server port, and for me I'm just going to go with 8080. Just choose a port that's not running anything else. And after that, we're going to need to add a few variables. So first is Spring Data MongoDB.uri. And then after that, we're going to need to select what database we're going to be using. So we're going to do that with spring.data and then MongoDB database. Now we don't have these yet, but I'll show you how to get them in just a moment. So if you just go MongoDB.database, and now we need to set up our MongoDB instance. So if we open up MongoDB, and for this we're going to start with a blank project, and we'll just call it Azure Java. We'll hit next. I'm already added as the project owner, so we'll hit create project. Now for this, what we're going to do is we're just going to create a cluster. We're going to choose the M0. It's perfectly fine running the free version. So provider will choose Azure, and we're going to create deployment. This will take just a moment to spin up, but we're going to add our username. Now make sure you keep track of this, the username and password. I'll just take what's accepted there, create your own. This won't be there when you're following along with the tutorial. And we'll hit create database user. And while this is spinning up, I'll cut back just as everything's ready to go. Now that everything's ready to go, we're going to choose our connection method. So for this, we're connecting with our Java application. So we're going to choose driver, and then we're going to choose Java. And we're just going to copy this string here. So if we go back to our application, this is our MongoDB URI. So we can just copy that there as is. Now for the database, we don't actually need to worry about setting it up manually. If we just call this image metadata, once we start interacting with our MongoDB database and trying to put stuff into the image metadata database, it will create it automatically for us. Now, after this, we need to set up our Azure storage. So there's a couple more steps involved with this. If we go over and open up Azure, from the Microsoft Azure portal, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the search bar at the top, and we're going to type in storage accounts. So you'll see here there's storage accounts and storage accounts classic. Make sure you choose storage accounts. The classic version doesn't have all the features we need. So for this, we're going to create a new one. And we're going to assign the subscription and the resource group, and we're going to give it a name. So if I just call mine silly little blob, just make sure the name is unique. And after that, for the redundancy, I'm just going to change it to the low-cost version for this tutorial. Now we're going to go advanced. Everything here, we're fine to take the defaults. For networking, just make sure it has enable public access from all networks. That's fine for demos and tutorials. In the real world, you'll probably want to set up who can and where can connect to your API, but just to keep things moving along quickly, we're going to keep it at that. Data protection and encryption, we're fine taking the defaults. Tags, we're going to keep going. Add review. Perfect. So if we scroll to the bottom, and we're just going to hit create. Okay, so this will take a moment just to spin up. So you might be wondering, what is Azure Blob Storage and why use it for media files? So Azure Blob Storage is Microsoft's object storage solution, tailored for the cloud and optimized for storing massive amounts of unstructured data. And because it's specifically designed for delivering this type of data, it makes sense to use a service like this. So if we go to resource, next we need to do is we need to set up our containers. So the container is just going to hold all of our blobs. So if you think of it like a directory holding all of your files in your computer. For this, we're just going to call it blobby and create. Now after this, what we need to do is we need to get a connection string. So if we go down to the bottom here and we hit shared access signature, for this application we need to hit object just so we can modify blobs, create, delete them. After that, it comes with an expiry date. So this just means you'll need to keep generating connection strings. You can automate this process, but for this, we're just going to leave it at that. And we're going to hit generate. So you'll see here the blob endpoint is the one we're interested in. So the connection string at the top, we're just going to copy that to our clipboard and add it to our application. So if we open back up our application, we're going to add a couple more connections. So Azure.blob storage. So it's blob-storage. And then that's going to be connection-string. And we'll copy in that endpoint. And after that, we just need to give it our container name. So this one is going to be spring.cloud.azure. And then for this, it's going to be .storage.blob.container-name. So .storage.blob.container-name. And perfect. So you remember from earlier, we named ours Blobby. And we're fine taking that just as is. After that, that's everything we need to do in this application properties. We're just going to save this and we'll get started with the coding. So with this Spring application, we're going to have a couple of different layers. So the first thing we're going to set up is we're going to set up our model. To do this, we're going to go over to our source main and we're going to add a new package. So that's just going to be new package and we'll call this one .models. Perfect. Now in here, we're going to add our metadata model. So if we say new class, and we'll call this image metadata. Perfect. So from here, we just hit finish. So in our application, the model layer represents the data structures for our application. So from here, what we're going to do is first, we're just going to indicate to Spring that it's a document. So to do this, we're going to go document. And then we're going to let it know what collection we want this stored in our MongoDB database. So we're just going to say collection. And we'll say equals. And for this, we'll just say metadata. Yep, that should be perfect there. Now we need to import our document from Spring. And after this, we need to set a couple fields. Depending on your application, you might want different fields from me. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to set up an ID, maybe a caption, and then the URL, which will reference where the data is being stored in our Azure Blob Storage. So that's just going to be private, and we'll make our ID an object ID, which we'll need to import. And we'll just call that one ID. We'll say private string, and we'll just call this one caption. Similar to how you'd have captions when you're uploading to social media. And then we'll just have image URL. So that can be a string as well. Image URL. Perfect. So like I said, we're going to need to import object ID. And of course, when it's being stored in MongoDB, it's going to be an underscore ID. So just to tell Spring that we want this to be stored as underscore ID or to be our object ID in our document, we're just going to go at ID. And again, we need to import this. This just means it knows that this will be our underscore ID in MongoDB, and we don't need to break any naming conventions. Okay, now that we have those fields set up, we'll just create some getters and setters. So because I'm in Eclipse, I'm going to go up to source, and then from here, what I'm going to do is just generate getters and setters. We'll select all and generate. Perfect. Now for this application, we're just going to go with the one model. And again, like I said earlier, you may want to store stuff like time of creation, if this object has been versioned, anything that you might think will be important for your application. But once we have our model set up, our next step will be to set up our repository. So if we go back up here, we're going to hit new, package again, and we'll just call this one .repositories. And we hit finish. Perfect. And to this, we're going to add our interface, and we'll call this one image metadata repository. And repository. Perfect. So if we hit finish here, so this repository is going to be quite small, and in your Spring Boot application, your repository is responsible for interacting with the database or any data source. So this is where the CRUD operations happen. So you create, you read, or update. And what we're going to do is to skip setting these up manually, we're going to actually use Mongo repository. So if we go extends Mongo repository, and we're going to have this work with our metadata class, so that's image metadata. That's the model we'll be using. And then string, just as our fields there. Perfect. So we need to import a few. So we need to import Mongo repository, and we need to import our image metadata. Now, I didn't spell that right. So if we just change that, and we can import that model. Perfect. This is everything you need for your basic operations. If you're building out custom functions that go beyond what Mongo repository has available, you can set them up here, or you can set them up in a service layer or an implementation layer. That goes beyond the scope of this tutorial, but you can check over in our docs how to use Spring Data with MongoDB. So in our Spring Boot application, our service layer is what contains all of our business logic. So that will be the functions and operations that our application needs to actually perform the tasks. So for this, we need a couple of things set up. So first we need to indicate to Spring that this is a service layer. And to do that, what we just do is at the top here, we go @service, and we'll import that. And next we just need to bring a few things into the class. So first thing will be our repository. So if we go auto-wired, and we go private, now this will be our image metadata repository. Repository, always fun to spell, and image metadata. And then we'll just call this image metadata repository with a lowercase. Perfect. So we need to make a couple of imports again. So that's import autowired and import our repository. We'll just make a small correction there in the spelling, and everything else looks good. Next, what we need to do is we need to get our values out of application properties. So to do that, we're just going to go app value, and the first one we'll bring in will be our container name. So to do this, we're just going to go with that there, and it's going to be $, and in curly brace, this will be our first spring.cloud.azure.storage, and then that's .connection string, or .blob.container name, apologies. Container hyphen name, perfect. And then we'll just call this one container name. Private string container name. We'll import our values so we're able to use that. And next we need to actually get our connection string. So that's going to be app value. And then same for this one again, but it's going to be Azure Blob or Azure.Blob Storage. And we'll do that lowercase. And then that's going to be .connection string. Right, perfect. And we'll just call this one private string connection string. Now, there's going to be a few typos here just to fix. So this needs to be Spring, and everything else looks good. Perfect. So we can move forward from here. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to set up the actual functions that contain the logic for application now. So we'll start with just a find all one first. So if we just go public and we'll say list, and this will be a list of image metadata. Perfect. And then we'll just say find all. Now that needs to be a capital. And in this, we're going to make our imports first, but this is a short enough one to set up. And again, we need to import image metadata. But what we'll just do with this one is we'll just return the already set up, thanks to Mongo repository, the already set up find all function. So that's just image metadata repository. And no other logic is needed, just find all. Perfect. So you can see a list of what's available already in our repository, but find all is fine. That's perfect. So once we have actual stuff saved in our database, we'll just be able to get it there with that function. So what we need to do in this function is we need to set up our blob service client. We need to actually upload, and then from there, we're going to get our metadata. We're going to get the actual URL that everything is stored in, and we'll save that to our MongoDB database. So our first step is going to be initializing our blob service client. So to do that, we're going to go private blob service client. And what we'll do is we'll just call this blob service client. And now we're going to need to import this from the Azure library or Azure dependency, and we'll initialize it with our values. So that's our connection string that we imported. So if we create a post construct, and we'll call this public void init, we'll need to import this, and we're going to build it. So that's going to be our blob service client. And that's going to be a new blob service client builder. We're going to add a new line just to make this a little bit easier to follow, and that's going to be our connection string. And we have our connection string above. And then lastly, we just need to actually build it. So that's just going to be build client. Perfect. So once we import this, everything should be ready to go with that. So now we have our actual blob service client built, and we're going to use it in our function. So if we create our function here, we'll just call this public string, and we'll call this upload image with caption. And then we'll pass in our parameters. So for this tutorial, we're just going to pass in an image, and we'll give a caption just to give some context to the image. So if we call this multi-part file, and then our image, and then just a string will be our caption. Now, after this, we'll return, if everything goes well, we'll return our image uploaded successfully. Perfect. So we need to make a quick import. And before we do anything else with our method, we're just going to add a throws IO exception. Now, most of the metadata we'll actually use we'll get from the file being passed in. So first things first is we're going to get the file name, and we'll use this to name our blob. So if we go blob file name, and we can call this image.get original file name. After that, what we're going to do is we're going to need to make a blob client. So if we go blob client with a lowercase l, and we'll just call this blob client. And we'll say equals blob service client. After this, we'll pop in and we'll get our container client. So just on a new line to make it a little bit easier to follow, we'll go get container client. And we're going to use our container name for this that we have above. And then after that, we just need to get our blob client. So get blob client. And we'll use our blob file name. Perfect. So now that we have our blob client, we can upload. So to do this, we'll just go blob client dot upload. And in here, we're going to need a couple things. So first is our image file as an input stream. So that's just image.get input stream. Next, we need to get our image file size. So that's just image.get file size, or get size. And then lastly, we just need to set that to be true. Perfect. Okay. So now that we have that uploaded, what we're going to do is we're going to retrieve our URL from our upload. This is where it's being stored in our Azure Blob, and we're going to save that to the metadata so when we're interacting with our application, we can retrieve our image. So to do this, we're going to go string. What we'll do is we'll call this image URL, and we'll say equals blob client dot get URL. Now once we have that, we correct this. And another T, perfect. So you have everything we need there. We have all the metadata we need. We're going to just create this image metadata. So to do this, we're just going to create an image metadata down here. and we'll say equals, we'll just call this metadata. Say equals new image metadata. And we're going to start setting some of those fields. So first is our caption. And we'll call this caption that we have from our parameters. And next we'll give it the URL. And perfect. So now that we have that, we can use our function above just to save this to our MongoDB database. So we'll call our image metadata repository. And we'll just say .save with our metadata. Now when we call this function, our metadata will be successfully saved in the MongoDB database with the URL pointing to the blob containing our image file. Now that we have the service set up, last thing we need to do is we need to set up our API to actually interact with this. So to do that, we're going to create a controller. To create these API endpoints, we're just going to create one more package. So this will be the last one for the project, and this is going to be our controllers. Now in here, we're going to add a class, and we'll call this one just image metadata controller. Perfect. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to set up two endpoints for the sake of this tutorial. We're going to set up one just to upload and one to list what we have in our MongoDB repository. In order to create a REST API, what we're going to do is we're going to designate this as a REST controller. And we're also going to add the mapping. So this is just the URL endpoint that we'll have. So that's going to be @request mapping. And we'll call this one just image metadata. Perfect. Now we need to make these imports. And we can get started with creating these endpoints. So the endpoints are going to make use of the logic in our service. So what we need to do is we need to import that service. So we'll just go @autowired. And we'll say private image metadata service. And we'll just call this image metadata service. Perfect. Now we need to make a couple imports. That should be a lowercase w. And then we need to bring in our metadata service. Perfect. Okay, after that, we'll create our mapping. So the first one will just be our find all. So we'll say @get mapping. And we'll just have this being our default at the /. So in here, we'll say public and list. This will return our list of image metadata. And then we'll say get all image metadata. Fix any typos there. Now we need to make a couple of imports, including our model. And we need to return everything in our database. So to do that, we'll use our find all function. So that will be image metadata service dot find all. Perfect. So now that we have that, we're able to retrieve everything in our database. Our next endpoint we're going to set up will be our upload. So we'll just call this @get mapping. And for the path for this, we'll say /upload. And now we'll say public. We'll return a string as a confirmation. And then we'll say upload image. And in here, we're going to add our parameters. So we need to upload our image and our caption. So to do this, we're going to use @request_param. We need to say what name we're going to give this parameter. So we'll call this one image. And then this will be a multi-part file that we'll just call image. And our next parameter we're going to need will be our caption. So we'll say again @request_param. This one we can just call caption. I'm going to add this to a new line just to make it a little bit easier to read. And then for this, we'll just have it as a string. So once we have that, we'll import our request param. We'll import our multi-part file. And then we'll add a return statement. So our return statement will just be the string we get either if an exception is thrown or if our image is successfully uploaded. So to do that, we're going to go image metadata service. And we're going to call our function that we created. So that's upload image with caption. And here we have our image and our caption. Perfect. Now, what are we missing here? We need to add our throws exception. So if we add that above, there's our throw IO exception and we're ready to go. We can test our application. Now with our application running on port 8080, what we're going to do is we're going to test our endpoints. So I'm using Postman for this. You can use curl requests, whatever you prefer. What I'm going to do is first I'm just going to verify that our database and our blob is empty. So you'll see our find all return nothing. If we pop over to our database, this should be true. So there should be nothing in our collection and nothing in our containers. So no blobs. Perfect. Now let's see if our post works. So here I just have an image that I have locally and a caption. So for the caption, I'm just saying MongoDB is web scale. Now if we send this with our post request, so we do get our return image and metadata uploaded successfully. And we'll just test our get all, see if this works in this case. Perfect. Okay, so we are returning what's in our database here. So that will be our caption, our image URL, so where this is saved in our Azure Blob, and then our object ID. So if we want to pop over here, we can see we have our image. We'll take a look what that looks like. So just in this case, our image of a bear. And then in our database, if we refresh this, we should have our image metadata. Yep, so we have our MongoDB as web scale and the URL location for that blob. So if we were returning this to the front end, we'd be able to store this as our image and download it from there or display from there. Now that wraps up our tutorial on how to build the Java Spring Boot API that interacts with MongoDB and Azure Blob Storage. If you like this tutorial, if you found it helpful, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave a comment below if you have any questions or any feedback. And if you want to learn more, head over to the MongoDB Developer Center, check out our channel for more videos, or head over to our community forums and learn what other people are building with MongoDB. Bye.